Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today's session highlights a major but still underused opportunity, recovering critical minerals from byproducts and mine waste to reduce import reliances and strengthen U.S. supply chains. We all hear about germanium, gallium, neodymium, and other critical minerals in the news, but what is less appreciated is that many of these minerals that we worry about aren't always mined directly. They are co-products or byproducts recovered alongside major metals like copper or iron ore. That means they're often not economic on their own, which is exactly why technology, policy direction, and market design are really essential. We're seeing incredible industry momentum in this space. Companies are pursuing full value mining and demonstrate that tailings, waste, and residuals can be viable solutions to advance critical minerals. We now understand the scale of that endowment, and we'll hear more of this from one of our presenters today in terms of the potential that sits in our unrecovered materials in the US. And finally, I'll note that the policy direction is also starting to take shape. Secretary Burgum was able to put out an executive or secretary level order directing agencies to map mine waste, expand funding eligibility, increase recovery technologies, and align regulations in coordination with other agencies. And then we've also seen the Department of Energy's notice of funding opportunity for pilots and demonstrations to extract and process minerals from mine waste, tailing, and end-of-life streams. Taken together, there's a lot to discuss on this webinar. It will follow a very similar format that you've seen if you tuned in with us yesterday. We'll begin with a leading member of Congress working on this issue, followed by insights from a true technical expert in this space, and then a distinguished panel to broaden the conversation. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to Congressman Gary Palmer. Congressman Palmer is the chairman of the Subcommittee on Environment under the Energy and Commerce Committee, who has been a leading voice expanding domestic alternatives for mine waste, tailing, and end-of-life materials. Over to you, Chairman.
I've said for some time now that we are in an artificial intelligence and quantum computing arms race with China and Russia. And whoever wins that arms race won't be a superpower, they'll be the superpower. It is our responsibility in Congress to ensure that the United States wins this race, and it is vital we lead the world in these sectors. To do that, we need to secure the supply chain for processed and refined rare earth and critical minerals. Mine recovery of aggregate materials, once considered waste, will be a significant part of this effort, and I'm glad to see that this is being prioritized by the executive branch. Our goal should be to create a circular economy in the homeland, which will include access to the aggregate and the capacity to separate, process, and refine the minerals. Because the needs are severe and immediate, the United States government will need to work collaboratively with the private sector, including permitting reform and investment. The United States has already made investments domestically and internationally that are helping us meet our needs. That includes mineral extraction with the ability to utilize all byproducts available. In that regard, the value that mine tailings and byproducts add to the supply chain cannot be overstated. The science study is right. The United States has access to the critical minerals and rare earth elements that we need, but it is the recycling, processing, and refining capacity that is lacking that we must build. For the last 5 years, literally since COVID, I've been warning that there are only 9 major rare earth element refineries in the world. 8 are in China, the other is owned by Lynas, an Australian company, and is located in Malaysia. There is not a single rare earth element refinery in the Western Hemisphere. We are working to clear the way in Congress for investors and private industry to come in and reshore refineries and smelters in the United States, as well as invest in mine recovery and mineral tailings. Bringing this industry back to the United States is the key to reducing reliance on China. I think this is a 3-tiered effort. The top tier focuses on international agreements and investments such as the $9.5 billion deal with Australia and the deals with Japan, Malaysia, and Saudi Arabia. This Friday, the White House will be hosting 8 nations: Japan, South Korea, United Arab Emirates, Singapore, the Netherlands, United Kingdom, Israel, and Australia. The second tier is focused on domestic efforts, identifying companies with some capacity for mining, separation, processing, and refining, including recycling materials from black mass. Together, the first 2 tiers should substantially help meet both our economic security needs as well as our military needs. The third tier is building out the processing and refining infrastructure we need to eliminate any ability of China or any other adversarial nation to threaten the United States or our allies by cutting us off from refinement minerals and elements, as they did earlier this year. To support this effort, I've introduced the Securing America's Mineral Supply, SAMS Act, that will codify 5 of President Trump's executive orders aimed at revitalizing U.S. critical mineral production and ending reliance on the Chinese Communist Party for essential resources. Last week, I introduced the Air Permitting Improvements to Protect National Security Act, which will amend the Clean Air Act to provide a practical pathway for expedited permitting of essential manufacturing and critical mineral facilities while maintaining compliance with the Clean Air Act. It allows for the President, and the President only, to sign a waiver so that these facilities continue their operations as long as they meet other agreed upon environmental standards. We also have the Defense Production Act, DPA, at our disposal to expedite permitting for these facilities, which are critical to our national security. In addition to securing our domestic critical mineral supply and stockpile, we're also working with our allies and friends around the world. That is why I've been working to form a Western Hemisphere alliance as a soft power alternative to China. I've met with dozens of foreign dignitaries from Europe, Latin America, Central Asia, the Indo-Pacific, and Sub-Saharan Africa to emphasize the need to work collaboratively. To meet our needs will also require a major investment in new baseload power generation. I'm a strong advocate of meeting this demand with small modular nuclear reactors. There are over 300 shuttered power generation facilities across the nation, most of them formerly coal-fired power plants, where the transmission lines are still in place. Where practical, we should utilize these facilities for recycling, processing, and refining, and use SMRs as the power source. By reconnecting to the existing transmission lines, we could increase the baseload power needed for processing and refining while avoiding increasing utility rates for local residents and businesses. This would also help meet the energy needs for data centers. And by utilizing these existing brownfield sites, we help mitigate the not in my backyard opposition. Bottom line, we have about a 5-year window to build the infrastructure needed to eliminate our reliance on China. This should not be a partisan issue. We've got to put politics aside, particularly on permitting for processing and refining, as well as the new energy infrastructure needed to power the facilities. I believe that this is this generation's space race, and the United States can't win it without securing our critical mineral and rare earth element supply chain. We need to be thinking in the long term. The development of technical and institutional knowledge in these areas will be what sustains the United States as the world's leading superpower.
Thanks so much, Congressman. In those remarks, we heard the full gamut of international partnerships, permitting reform, technology, the geopolitics. There's not much left for us to talk about, but we'll shift to a more expert perspective now, grounding the rest of the conversation. It is my incredible pleasure to give the virtual floor to Professor Elizabeth Holley, whose recent Colorado School of Mines research quantified the critical minerals endowment currently locked in U.S. mine ore that goes unrecovered today, again, laying the foundation for the conversation we'll have on this panel following her remarks. I'll turn it over to you, Elizabeth. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Abigail, and thank you to SAFE for putting this together, as well as to my fellow panelists. This has become one of my favorite topics, and I'm really excited to talk to you about it today because I think there's a huge amount of opportunity here. I also think we need to contextualize that opportunity appropriately because this isn't a silver bullet. It's going to be a little bit more complicated than that, but I will try to provide you with that overview. So thinking about our critical minerals list, it really is half the periodic table. And I think comparing that to what we produce on federal land, this map shows you U.S. hard rock metal mines on federal land that were operating in 2023. And you can see 10 mineral commodities there. Compared to our list of 60, that leaves some serious gaps. What are we going to do about it, and how much can these active operations help us close some of that gaps? Thinking about the geologic and geographic diversity of critical minerals, I think is an important reminder for all of us. I really appreciate what I heard in the SAFE webinar yesterday, drawing a distinction between things like lithium and copper that we need a lot of, and things like gallium and germanium that we don't need much of. These are not going to be apples to apples solutions. And I like to use the analogy from agriculture that we wouldn't have one set of policy tools that helps us manage our supply of beef, corn, pineapples, shrimp, avocados, and wheat. So I think we need a similarly diverse set of tools. And byproduct recovery and mine waste recovery are going to be among those tools. Thinking about what our different supply options are and remembering that we have 60 different minerals for which we're trying to problem solve here, we can import, we can develop new mines in the US, and I think both of these are going to be important solutions. So this idea of waste to wealth is a really important tool that we have. It's not a replacement for some of these other options. It simply might help us move the needle on some of those problems. In terms of what I envision as the waste to wealth category, that includes recycling, as well as byproducts from active US mines and mine waste recovery from accumulated mine waste, either at active sites or legacy sites. And I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that we also can lower demand through substitution and efficiency. I think these don't get talked about much in the critical minerals space, but they're an incredibly important part of the solution. So I like to use food analogies because I think they're universally understandable. I imagine each of these 6 things as ingredients. If you're going to bake a cake, say that's recovering germanium, you're going to have a different ratio of those ingredients compared to whether you're baking bread. Similar basic ingredients, but the proportions of some of those supply options are going to be different, say if it's copper. So I think that this approach should underpin our national strategy towards critical minerals, and we should stop doing these apples to apples solutions, and we really should systematically look at the periodic table, or at least half of it, and think about the ratios of these different supply types that we're going to use to solve this problem. In my research group, we work on new mines as well as byproduct and mine waste recovery, and we bring together science, social science, and engineering to try to look at these problems very holistically. We have published a lot of things in this space, and this next slide just gives you a smattering of those publications. The one that we're going to talk about today was recently published in Science, and as Abigail mentioned, we produced a statistical estimate that is, we believe, quite robust for what is being mined in the US today but not being recovered. So in order to dive into that, I find that there is a lot of sort of mixed messaging around byproducts versus mine waste recovery, and they're really opposite sides of the same coin. So if we are again in our kitchens, you could be preparing a salad and you have a lemon there in your kitchen, and you can squeeze more out of the lemon in your kitchen. That's this byproduct scenario over on the left, where we're in the active mining operation. That lemon has not yet become waste. We're going to squeeze more out of it before it becomes waste. Moving into the mine waste category, if you put your lemon in the trash and then eventually it goes into the landfill, then it becomes accumulated mine waste, either at an active facility or perhaps in the many hundreds of thousands of abandoned mine lands that we have across the US, which I put in the legacy mine waste category. So these are slightly different. They are slightly different problems. And I think for us, the most immediate one where we can really turn on the tap is byproduct recovery at active facilities, because we've got infrastructure there, the mines are operating, things are happening. So what is it that we can recover from these sites? These red dots show you the quantity of every element that was mined, meaning it went through the processing, it went through the kitchen, basically, in 2023, and was unrecovered. And those yellow sticks are the amount that we imported. So you can see for pretty much every element, if we recovered everything in the kitchen, in the mining operation, before it became waste, we could then replace imports. Now, that is incredibly powerful. That shows that we have everything we need. But remember, this is only going to be one piece of the solution, because 100% recovery is just not realistic. So this figure shows you the percent recovery required to replace imports. And I want to draw your attention to those elements over on the left, where we could only recover just 1% of what we're currently mining and leaving unrecovered, and we would replace imports. These are elements like gallium and germanium, for example. 1% recovery is a very realistic target. It may mean we only need to build demonstration or pilot scale facilities rather than going to full commercial implementation. The pink box in the middle is those elements for which 15% recovery could eliminate the need to import. So I think these are realistic targets. I don't think every element in those boxes is going to be knocked out in this particular way, but we should certainly start. And for many of those, particularly those small market commodities, we can go ahead and eliminate the problem through very modest amounts of byproduct recovery. I wanted to show you that we do also have data by site. I've purposely made it too small to see because we're working on what the appropriate access to that information might be. But if you are a mine operator, we can help you understand what is in your facility. If you are a decision maker and you're worried about a particular element, we can help you understand which site is perhaps the best target. And one of the interesting things that we see here is that concentration, while important, is not necessarily as important as throughput. So that means the amount of material that's going through the mill every year. Even if the concentrations are low, you can still make a big difference by recovering a small amount of that. We have also done this for mine waste as well. And we haven't published those numbers yet, so I'm not able to share them today, but they are enormous. This is the accumulated mine waste at sites that have been mined for metals in the US over the last 40 years. And then we've also come up with ways to prioritize and rank these sites based on reduction in cost to the economy or reduction in import reliance. So those are different ways that we can sort of slice up the data and hopefully contribute to this in a useful way. We really want to see the investments that are being made being directed in a way that most efficiently moves the needle. So in bringing byproduct and mine waste recovery together, I think there are a number of different ways that you could do this. In the first scenario, we might only go for byproducts. That's because these operations are already up and running. It's maybe simpler to install additional capacity there, as in this DOE opportunity that has come out recently. The second scenario is, what if our need for that element outstrips our production rate of the main product to which it is tied? You can think of the byproducts as flows. Those are amounts that are going through annually. We might need to dip into our stocks, and those are the amount that are contained in accumulated mine waste. Now, the stocks only count as usable. They're only insurance if we have the facilities and the ability, the technical ability to actually recover that material. So I would probably put the two of those together, and then the other thing that you can do is go back into main products in the mine waste, things like copper, gold, and silver that might really drive the economics of some of these operations. So that's scenario 3. To me, the big question, why aren't we doing this and how do we unlock it? The first thing is national inventory studies like ours, also what the USGS is doing, bringing together these kind of high-level scoping with additional validation at sites. The second is that we are sorely lacking R&D on critical mineral deportment, meaning the mineral in which these elements sit and how that recovery would then relate to the main product and whether it is indeed recoverable at all. So since the defunding of the Bureau of Mines, our national expertise in geometallurgy has really resided within universities. And I think universities offer the opportunity to help close this gap between the Department of Interior and DOE in a way that could be a really great partnership. The last piece that I think we're going to dig into further in the questions from Abigail is, how do we incentivize the recovery? And I know Jenna has some thoughts on this, and so does Bert. So I won't steal their thunder, but I will turn it back over to you and look forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Holley. Whenever I see you present on our webinars or elsewhere, it makes me want to go back to school. I'm very excited to be able to open up the conversation now to our 2 additional panelists who will be joining Dr. Holley and answering some questions. Before we dive in, I do want to remind folks that are tuning in that they can use the Q&A function in the Zoom to be able to submit some questions that we'll be able to hopefully get to in the remaining time at the end. To start us off, or before we start off, I want to just make sure I contextualize who's on the screen now. So Bert and Jenna have just joined us. Bert Thomas is a division director within the new Office of Critical Minerals and Energy Innovation in the U.S. Department of Energy, and he's been leading some of the funding charge on the pilot and byproduct from unconventional mineral recovery that we talked about in the opening. He may mention this a little bit further. And then Jenna Schroeder is the Director of Government Relations for Critical Minerals at Rio Tinto. Rio is, or I know you do more than critical minerals, Jenna, forgive me, but I think that's how I see you. Rio is emerging as an incredible model for the co and byproduct recovery, and hopefully we'll hear some of these great examples from scandium to tellurium, and then the new developments on gallium from you in the conversation. So the first question I want to pose you both, having heard Professor Holley's presentation, is from your perspective and where you sit in your respective sectors, what is the significance of byproduct and tailings recovery for the government and for industry? I'll turn maybe to Bert first to start us off.
Oh, thank you. What is so exciting about the study that Dr. Holley described there is that you immediately see that the problem isn't that we don't have the materials around us. The problem is that we just haven't tried to make them valuable. And particularly with respect to mine waste and with respect to the ongoing industrial processes that are happening, if you look at the map of all the states that are producing minerals today, there may only be 16 or 18 states that are producing valuable metal products from ore and other mineral resources. That means there's 36 states out there, I didn't do the math right, like the one I'm in, Oregon, that have the potential to add to the mineral production balance sheet of the country. And this is an example of where we need to start looking for them. Thanks.
Thanks. Jenna, over to you.
Yeah, what is the significance of byproduct recovery? I think for us as a mining company, we're committed to something you mentioned in your opening remarks called full value mining. What that means that we're committed to using our assets to the fullest extent possible. And part of that is a commitment, both to the countries and jurisdictions that we operate in, because we recognize that there's, significant need for these minerals. We have, to this end, we have been doing comprehensive deportment and testing work, especially at our North American assets, but also around the world for a number of years now. And, our mines, some of them are very old. I have a 151-year-old mine and a 122-year-old mine here in the United States. So we have, not just the run of mine or what's coming out of the mine now, but just a tremendous amount of legacy tailings that we're also sampling to try to understand where are these materials, can we get them into the supply chain, and how do we do that economically, which is really, to Bert's point, the crux here. And I think it's important because, we heard on your webinar yesterday, the SAFE webinar, that we were not traditionally looking for these commodities. In many regards, we used to get penalized for having them as impurities when we delivered things like copper. And so we weren't really keeping records for the first, 120 years that we were operating these mines. And so there's a lot of work to do to understand where these commodities are. But I think when you look at our operations now, some of our most exciting projects are actually a result of byproduct recovery. You mentioned, for example, tellurium. We committed several years ago to trying to produce tellurium out of our copper operations at Kennecott in Utah. And we produce a crude form of tellurium there that is sent to Canada to a company to refine. And then that tellurium is actually resent to the United States, where a US company called First Solar uses it to produce solar panels. And there's a great circular economy story there because we've now installed some of those solar panels at Kennecott to help power our operations. So it's kind of like a great example of the circularity of this sector. But that's something that, we knew it was there. We knew it was sitting as kind of a byproduct, and we thought, well, let's just see if we can go after it. But an important part of the success of that story is also having an off-taker like First Solar who wanted to, incentivize us to get it out. And I also will say we've partnered with both the Canadian and US governments to support recovery of scandium from our titanium operations in Quebec. Again, scandium is not something you need in very large quantities. I think sub 100 metric tons per year globally, but something that's quite hard to get nowadays in the US. And we knew if we committed to it that there was some really interesting technical kind of R&D done on our titanium tailings to access that scandium. But in both of these cases, to Bert's points, right? We don't need to open a whole new mine. It's sitting there. What takes is kind of commitment to finding it, and then trying to figure out the right kinds of models to incentivize extraction and get it into the supply chain. So byproduct recovery for us, I think, is an incredibly important part of how we see ourselves operating.
Thanks, Jenna, and always love to hear that example with the tellurium, and I'm sure, especially given scandium's importance in strengthening aluminum and all of your aluminum output, there's some synergies there as well that really benefit Rio and also the end users. We heard this kind of at the end of Professor Holley's presentation. You know, if this was an easy economic problem, it would already be solved, but there are some challenges in byproduct recovery. We were disabused that maybe it's not about the concentrates in your presentation, but we heard Jenna talk about some of the overwhelming amounts of tailings to consider, and then there's also some financial aspects here. So I want to ask all three of you, and maybe try to give me one answer to this, but what in your opinion, the biggest challenge in byproduct recovery, and where do you see, you know, government's ability to kind of intervene here to possibly help? I'll bring you back into the conversation, Elizabeth, and then maybe start with you here.
Sounds good. I think for me, the R&D challenges in terms of geometallurgy are certainly easily cracked if we fund that. And I so appreciate Rio Tinto's efforts on this, and we are working with them in various capacities too. Not all companies are doing that, and it's just simply not within the scope of many of their work and not what their shareholders want them to do. I will say it is more about incentivizing companies to do that. We can, you know, a relatively modest, I would say, amount of funding towards the geometallurgical R&D is going to really make it happen. But then once we know what's there, how do you get companies to be like Rio and step up to the plate and do it? I think that's a big challenge.
I think that touches the core of the problem, which is that in the private sector in the US, everybody competes on profit. And so we try to maximize profit, right? The companies can't do anything unless there's economic value to the company. And that's a vulnerability when on the other side, there's the ability for an oversupply condition to persist and then be occasionally removed, which is now perceived as a risk of supply to everybody. So that's just very difficult for a corporate decision maker to design a plant that needs to exist and operate and be profitable for a long enough time period to pay itself off. So this is a core failure of the market. And it's one where when this happens, the government gets involved. So if this were food, we would have the ability to establish agreements between suppliers and processors that are like food co-ops. If you live in farm country, co-ops are everywhere, right? It's how we ensure that the arrangements in the supply chain are secure and the food continues to flow. If you were to have a minerals co-op, it would be illegal today. That's an example of a policy approach, developing virtual vertical integration between the suppliers and the producers that I think is possible and is core to the functions the government has to enable mineral production. Over.
Yeah, and I'll say, you know, for us, I think it's really creating that policy environment that allows for security of investment. We don't necessarily need, you know, a grant to operate. We would invest in recovery if we knew and could be certain that we could recover our investment by having either, you know, an off-taker, by having, you know, in the case of some of these commodities, even a price floor. You know, for some of this stuff, if we invest, there's no certainty that product won't flood the market once we come on to production. And we've seen that in other commodities like cobalt. And so that's kind of, you know, a cautionary tale. But for us, I think, touching on that geometallurgy comment, which is so true, I think, you know, there's this internal valley of death that exists in companies as well. Like, we are very committed to doing the department work, the testing work, understanding what's in our assets. And often, you know, our R&D teams are also committed to working on the flow sheets and those extraction pathways. But so then you get to a point where you know you have the material and you know where it is and you know how to get it out, but you have to actually then spend money and CapEx to construct the recovery circuit. And that's really where, to Bert's point, as you know, a company with shareholders, I can't advocate for a project that's going to lose my company money. And so for us, it's really, you know, I know that I'm speaking as a large miner, and this is a unique perspective, but for me, it's not really that low TRL work. It's this mid TRL piece. It's like post bench scale pilot once we need to actually spend money to really build out the circuits at the mine to recover this commodities. That's where I see kind of the biggest gap. And so that's one where, again, to Bert's point, policy solutions would be welcome.
Great suite of challenges to consider. I wanted to just note on Bert's comment about the co-op approach. The first report SAFE ever did on critical minerals, we recommended a co-op for rare earths particularly, and we were definitely given some negative feedback because of the anti-competition aspects of this, but then also just the industry buyers' willingness. And now I think everybody in post April 4th this year with the MOFCOM export controls is maybe reconsidering the need for something like that. I want to build on Jenna's last point in terms of kind of the operational standpoint, really helping people visualize when these types of recoveries occur for byproducts. Is it during beneficiation, smelting, refining, combination, after? Again, you said you're checking your tailings. And so what should we kind of impart upon attendees in terms of the technical flow and then restraints in accessing recovery here? And others can jump in, but mostly I think this is directed to Jenna.
Yeah, I'm interested to hear what everyone says, but for us, it's definitely at that latter end of the midstream. So it's really coming out of the smelter, sometimes out of the refinery. The technical constraints are that these are often very bespoke solutions, right? Every ore body is different, and the characterization of that ore body when certain elements of the ore body are coming out of, via the concentrator and just the timing of mine development over the decades, the flow sheet that you need to design to target these materials, and really importantly, not impact the base metal or the primary metal production, like in the case of copper, for example, or aluminum, which in many ways is bankrolling the byproduct recovery, right? You don't want to touch your moneymaker. But each of these flow sheets is unique, and the geometallurgy that you need to do to figure out a solution is unique, and it takes time. And sometimes you can utilize a process that's been used before, but usually you're combining several processes to try to get to a solution and see if they work in combination. And it's not, necessarily straightforward. And that's why I think it's really, sometimes you get through these and you realize, well, one approach doesn't work. And so it's really important to try and pursue these solutions in parallel to try to get to a solution. But it's not straightforward. And I think that's what I would want to impart on the group is that, it's going to be a unique flow sheet for pretty much every mine and every commodity that you're targeting. And that's where, you get into these workforce conversations. I think there aren't that many people in the United States who can do this work. And so I'm glad to see the administration kind of focus on this. I know there's some work coming up. I think that DOE is leading on this specifically because it's we need to train more metallurgists so that we can do more of these flow sheet analysis in parallel. And it's, like I said, it's going to be probably bespoke in many ways.
I think that's a pretty good tee up for both of you in terms of the workforce challenges that DOE is approaching, and then just the lack of accredited institutions in the United States. There are only a handful compared to the dozens in China that are focused on metallurgy. And so for either of you, Bert or Dr. Holley, if you want to jump in and comment on those gaps or the bespoke ore grade point that Jenna made, which I think is incredibly important.
I'll just say that when we look at the problem in front of us, it is all oriented toward the policy objective of helping America lead the world in mineral production and processing. And that is such a massive challenge that it touches all the aspects, including the pilot scale processes that need to be able to show that the processing is possible, to show that investment can be well put forward, and to show that the companies who have an opportunity can actually produce at scale. And so the opportunity that our department has out for piloting and demonstrating byproduct mineral recovery is when we know that there's an opportunity and we know there's a technical approach that pencils out. Now we can prove that case with pilots. But to the point about needing people with expertise to do it, the country is not going to have time to go back 30 years and invest in these mining institutions. And so what we're going to have to do is figure out how to attract more people with disciplinary expertise to start thinking about metal and mineral production from the disciplines that they're coming from. It's pulling in technician staff from different places. It's drawing in people with the skill sets, working with their hands and working in hot environments. And it is also investing in the institutions that we have and growing more of those, like Dr. Holley's institution, so that we really can rebuild a future in which America is producing all the things that it needs, because we've now proven that we have the material we need, and that we can probably figure out how to process it, and that we're going to figure out how to prove that we can do it, but we are definitely going to make sure that Americans show up to do the work.
Great.
These are such great points, and I have so many things that I want to add, but I'll try to keep it brief. I think in response to Jenna, I love hearing your framing around these bespoke solutions, and I'll tell you kind of as a funny story. When we had initially submitted our statistical estimation work to science, one of the review comments was, well, that's very nice, but you need to tell us for every single one of these elements how you're going to get it out, how much can be recovered, and how much that's going to cost. And we sort of had this giant panic, like, well, it's half the periodic table, and for every single element, the case is going to be different in every single operating mine, and you need to know what the current flow sheet is and how that would impact the main product recovery. So there's so much potential, but it does really need that diligent and systematic work, and it needs to be strategically prioritized to where the best opportunities are. We can't just sort of say, we're going to do geomet across the board and expect that to make a difference. We got to be targeted. And then on the point of workforce, really following up on Bert's comment, we at Colorado School of Mines are doing our best to really make the case to this next generation of students that all of this work is very much in line with their social values and ways that they perceive that they want to participate in the American economy. And I think that partly involves bringing in more majors into these fields, and it also involves inspiring students from other majors who might be chemical engineers, for example, to start lending their skill sets to solving these problems. I will say, in terms of bandwidth, I think there's this sort of black box of the mining institutions, and we are in some way expected to help solve the problem. The mining institutions is a very short list, and within those institutions, our benches are not deep. So when I'm here, I'm not doing the research and I'm not supporting students. And there are only a handful of me in our institution, and we're one of the biggest. So I think finding ways to support these institutions to grow and bring on research faculty and teaching faculty is incredibly important, and it gives us the ability to help close this gap quickly.
And we're incredibly appreciative that you're joining us during final exams to actually present on this, and we hope that the findings of your study through this webinar go far and wide in educating people and then bringing them back to you to maybe pursue careers at mines and elsewhere. I wanted to maybe talk a little bit more about the government role in this, moving from byproduct recovery into commercial practice. And this is obviously going to be maybe more directed to Bert. There's been some interagency collaboration, we talked about at the top, the secretary's order, and then obviously the work that you're doing. How is that functioning? Like, what should people know about kind of the coordination across government to be able to leverage this? And then how are you bringing industry into the mix to help on both the technology gap side, but also obviously the funding that you've mentioned?
Okay, on the interagency collaboration, I have never seen such a collaborative environment. Every single one of these problems is multifaceted and requires multiple agencies to be involved. All those agencies are at the table, and everyone is looking towards solutions. The questions around permitting, questions around processing, questions around what is this ultimate size of the resource for the nation to rely on. Different agencies have different responsibilities, and the technical expertise kind of requires everyone at the table. So what I can say is that the collaborations are fruitful, they're happening, and I think it helps that the agencies are being told from the top, okay, we're going to work together. We're going to solve the problem together. The president told Department of Interior and Department of Energy to work together on prioritization. Okay, how do we know which mineral resources need investments? How do we know where the pathways are to leading the world in mineral production and processing? And from my perspective, the long-term goals are different but aligned with the sort of short-term needs. A lot of what we're seeing in the news is a short-term response to a thing we need immediately, right? But in reality, America doesn't make or produce many of the things that it needs today. This is not a problem we have in the future. This is a problem today. America drills wells to produce, oil and gas or gasoline for your car. Every single one of those wells is drilled with a drill bit that has tungsten at the end of it, and all that tungsten comes from one place. And so metaphorically speaking, not from America. And so these, solving the mineral resource challenges is a collaborative effort. And, to the point about mine waste in particular, the USGS has a team of people putting together a mine waste inventory. And, like the detailed work the USGS puts together, it is going to be a reliable resource with, an accounting of the nation's mineral possibility. And the Department of Energy is here to help establish how to process it, et cetera. And so in my view, we're spending our money as every way we can to incentivize the private sector, but then to accelerate the private sector by helping them de-risk and answer questions.
Thank you. Great. It's great to hear all of that positivity, and we're all, awaiting the DOE materials list too. That I know is also a collaborative effort building off of USGS findings. So, I wanted to. This is a question we received both in the webinar registration, but then also from our audience members. So I'll just jump to this because it's a good build on some of the government role. People have asked, what are the roles of tariffs of helping with the economics of byproduct recovery in the United States? We don't know yet where the 232 investigation into processed critical minerals and their derivatives will go, but if there are results from that work, how and recommended tariffs that come out of that, how would that maybe change or not change the byproduct and mine waste potential? And then similarly in the government toolbox, the 45X production tax credit, how does that help or hurt? Or it doesn't hurt, it's a 10% production tax credit, but how does that help this situation, or should it be changed to consider the benefits that we can leverage from mine waste and byproducts?
I'm happy to jump in on 45X because I think it's something that we really believe strongly in. And as someone who has a copper mine and a borates mine, both of which were recently added to the USGS critical minerals list just this year, I think we need to refresh 45X so that it references the current USGS list rather than being statically adopted the last version of the list. So things like borates and copper aren't included, but I think it could be an incredibly powerful tool. I'll also say one of the things that would be helpful, and for copper, we are vertically integrated. We're one of only 2 copper smelters in the United States, and so we're producing kind of that end copper cathode, the incredibly pure product. But for a lot of these critical minerals, things like the tellurium, things like gallium, things like bismuth that we're looking at, we're not producing to the purity level that 45X would require us to get credit. And there's obviously some horse trading you can do with your customers, but it really incentivizes kind of that midstream production level and less so the upstream because of those purity thresholds. So if I'm not producing, a critical mineral to, 99.99% purity, I don't get the tax credit. And so I'd personally like to see a little bit more nuance to benefit upstream extractors like myself. But I do think it's an existing tool. It's one we have that just needs a couple tweaks. I think it's well understood by legislators what they need to do to make it kind of broader and more applicable. And I'm very supportive of those changes.
I try to avoid talking about policy, but I will say one thing here, which is that for the private sector to respond, they need to see a persistent signal that's long enough that allows them to plan for it. And so, what is important primarily is, I think, the will and the interest that we now see in a bipartisan way that addresses these problems on a long enough time frame that the private sector can orient around.
Anything to add here, Elizabeth?
Bert said it so well. That's exactly what I was thinking. And really connecting it to your webinar yesterday, I think the price environment is the elephant in the room.
I think we're all waiting to see what the critical mineral 232 says, and I think which commodities they decide to focus on. There needs to be some recognition that it's sub-economic in the current market environment to produce these critical minerals. And there's different ways the administration could address that, whether it's via, things like trade policy via the 232s, or via things like the 45X tax credit, or via, the important work that DOE and the DOW are doing to incentivize mining companies. Those are all different tools, but the status quo doesn't work to get these things out of the ground and into the supply chain.
Thank you guys, and thanks for everybody doing the pre-watch of the webinar yesterday, which is a good build on this conversation. We received another question, and this really kind of continues Jenna's line of thought around the bespoke nature of the ore bodies and how you need to take those different approaches as a result. Not all of these are kind of created equal in terms of what they're commingled with, right? And so are there concerns for different commodities when it comes to, or critical minerals from mine waste or byproducts when it comes to the toxicity of the waste left behind, or how you handle that? And maybe you could give some examples if you have any on hand in terms of where this might be different and might have different, requirements from a regulatory perspective and how you handle and leverage the opportunity.
I'm happy to jump in here. So many of the components that might be considered as a regulatory concern also have a value if collected and produced in a form that's valuable, saleable. Uranium and thorium are parts of the nuclear fuel cycle, for example. And I think it's important to recognize that many things that we're using the word waste a lot. Many of these things that we're calling waste, if recovered, wouldn't be waste. And it's particularly true for the things that might be preventing the project from moving forward. Over.
Add to that with another example. In my other life as an ore deposit geologist, I work a lot on Carlin type deposits, which is where most of the Northern Hemisphere's gold is produced. And there's much more arsenic and antimony in those deposits than there is gold. And we've seen some real moves around antimony lately. And the question is, we certainly know it's there, and recovering even just some of that would probably make a difference in producing a cleaner waste. How can we support our mining sector in being able to do that?
Great, thank you guys. Another question we received from the audience is, how educated are downstream consumers on the necessity of critical minerals? And I'll maybe tweak this a little bit to say, especially these, smaller trace amount minerals that enable the devices that we've all logged in on, the ones that we've been talking about that are commonly byproducts or left in waste piles. And so what further efforts are needed to educate them? It seems like we have a pretty good handle from the mining side on the opportunity and the costs affiliated with mine waste with byproducts. But how do the downstream end users see the problem, if at all, in your opinions?
I think what I would like to see is almost an extension of that conversation, which isn't just how familiar are they with the problem. And I think for some supply chains like cobalt, there's been a lot of press and a lot of attention to the ESG issues raised with how cobalt is produced in a lot of parts of Africa. But I think the question is, are consumers willing to pay more? Is there a price premium that we can recognize for producing things to a high standard? So Rio Tinto is one of world's largest mining companies, and it's very important to us that we operate to the highest ESG standards. But that's not something that necessarily gets us more money. And so when we're looking at producing these critical minerals, wherever it be in the world, does the consumer not only realize the importance of those commodities, but are they willing to potentially pay more for an end product if those are produced in a way that's fair, ethical, and sustainable? And I don't know if we have seen that outside of maybe the cobalt supply chain, though. Interested to hear what my co-panelists think. To me, that's the real question, because it's not just how do we get these things into the supply chain, it's how do we do so, again, ethically and sustainably.
So I think part of the value is maybe understood by the analogy I've used with seatbelts. So, what is the value of a seatbelt, right? It's not the value of the material, right? It's the fact that if you don't wear it, you're not safe. And do the public accept that, right? Maybe it took a while. It took a while, designing it took a little bit of work, right? But we now have a public that understands that if you drive a car, You need to wear a seatbelt to be safe. That is what these byproduct minerals are, the seatbelts of the high-tech economy. And if we don't need to do it, except that if we don't do it, we're all at risk. And that's what the public, I think, needs to understand.
I think something that I can add here is thinking about social acceptance of recovering byproducts or from mine waste. I'm not a social scientist, and so I'm not completely speaking on behalf of the social scientists in my group, but just sort of illustrating the kind of work that we do. I think it's case study dependent, and every community is going to be different. There are some with whom we work in Colorado who are sort of used to mine waste existing as it does, and the idea that a new operation might come in and it kind of looks like new mining, and that's not necessarily welcomed, whereas in other communities it's a great opportunity to clean up some things that have been real environmental and safety hazards. So I think that, again, bespoke is going to be the word here. We need social acceptance for these projects, and the new thinking of that is as local drivers for projects. But I don't think that we can assume that because these are critical minerals that we're talking about, that necessarily moves the needle for a community that might be in the neighborhood of one of these projects.
Great answers. We've just got a ton of questions flooding in now, so I'm going to try to go quickly here. One was very gallium specific, and I think this question is maybe on the heels of the Alcoa US, Japan, Australia deal, specifically asking if the flow sheets for gallium production associated with alumina refineries exist, or are there examples where there's no government financing involved? Where can we get to a point where these projects could exist without the government support? Welcome others. Jenna, you kind of tipped your hat to your gallium work earlier, so if you want to close out those thoughts, that'd be great.
Yeah, I will say I'm selfishly pursuing a competing project on gallium. So while that project in Australia is great, I'm going to speak about my project, which is in Quebec. We are one of the largest producers of aluminum to the United States, and when we refine alumina in Quebec with hydropower, I should say, so incredibly sustainable, and the operation again is already there and producing. We can recover gallium from what's called our bare liquor, which is a process fluid that is part of the alumina recovery supply chain. And I would say we've been pursuing this project in cooperation with a US company for the last couple of years, who's helping with the R&D on this. At the current cost of gallium, there's no economic rationale to produce it. If you look at what gallium, even after the export controls, the price of gallium hasn't risen enough to incentivize the build out of recovery of gallium from those productions, absent some kind of creative policy solution or government financing. It's simply the numbers don't work. So I would say it's the best example of a commodity where it's incredibly important to the semiconductor supply chain, to defense supply chains. We have a ton of it. And I would say the flow sheet, the technical challenges there usually revolve around resin selection and just making sure you can find kind of the right approach. It's not an insurmountable technical challenge. They are relatively bespoke, not as much as in other commodities, I'd say. But that's when we're financing is the key challenge, because we could meet, several 100% of our demand for gallium just with our project, and we could do so within a couple years, and I could do so within like 3 years, let's say. And I think it's eminently doable, but it's one where there's absolutely no economic rationale to do so.
Thank you, super helpful. Not seeing you guys jump in, maybe I'll turn to another question. Bert talked about kind of the North Star and having the US lead on processing. Jenna gave an example of how you sell to another company to do the processing, and then they sell the process material for the solar panels to First Solar, and you guys buy those back. The question we received from the audience is, how do you envision recovery, whether it's through byproducts, mine waste, or other options, plugging into the midstream processing capacity, and what other gaps exist there?
I mean, the gap is that there just aren't enough of those companies, right? Like, you know, our partner on Tellurium is 5M Plus. They're well known in this space. There are a number of competitors and that, you know, are in this space as well. Companies like Umicore. I mean, you see others kind of like Reelement jumping in, doing excellent work. But I think there just simply is not enough midstream capacity. There aren't enough partners for us to partner with. And so when you're looking to do things like prioritize, you know, what kind of processes are they building? They have to understand what is available upstream, like who can send the material. And so it's a really important kind of holistic ecosystem that depends on what I can get out of my ore body and send to them in a crude form and what they can do to further refine it. And then that all depends on a downstream signal from an off-taker who's willing to pay us both for that work in general, right? And so you know, there aren't a whole lot of vertically integrated critical mineral projects because, you know, the goal of my company and what we do well is mining, right? So we're going to try to mine. We're not going to try to get into these bespoke processing solutions for very small grades or very small tonnages of materials. That's just not an economic proposition for us. We're just going to operate the mine, which is what we do well. So I just personally think we need a lot more of these companies who can do this work. It's a capacity issue.
Mhm.
So what Jen is describing is the need for a healthy minerals ecosystem that can, you know, respond and process all the materials that we're trying to buy at the other end. And that's the kind of thing that, you know, the government can help exist, but it has a really difficult time building without working closely with the private sector. And so I think that knowing the markets we want to see, you know, the natural production ecosystem we want to see is a big part of the solution.
Anything to add here, Dr. Holley?
No, not on this one. Thanks.
So I'll close this out with a final question for you all. You know, during the presentation, we saw that there's a lot of distinct opportunities, and we heard this from Jenna as well on the thing we keep coming back to, the bespoke ore body and how that impacts things. So how do we ultimately compare these different opportunities in recovery and identify which ones offer the strongest economic case by case for byproduct and for byproduct production for targeted support? And so kind of going back to your quandary when science came back to you, Elizabeth, and said, hey, what's the next step here? How do you do that prioritization? And then what can we maybe see in terms of short-term and medium-term and long-term development and focusing on those opportunities?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think as researchers, we're trying to contribute in a number of ways, obviously on the very detailed technical work to unlock a particular byproduct or to help make new mining more efficient and be able to recover more. But I think where we would really like to go is I want to see this be strategy driven. I am frustrated with the game of whack-a-mole where, you know, a new threat pops up and we just try to recover enough of that element from one particular place to get rid of that problem. We are on the back foot and we need to be more proactive. And so really we should be looking at the whole periodic table, all the things that we need and what our various options are. And I have a whole way of thinking about that where you analyze each element in terms of risk, time, and cost for each of those supply scenarios. And if we were able to develop a really proactive strategy from there, I think that would direct investment. It would help the private sector understand what some of those opportunities are and have those be de-risked. And there would be ample opportunity for partnership that's really meaningful rather than reactive. So if I could wave a magic wand, that's how I'd like to see it. And I know that we're really trying to contribute to drive that big picture understanding with these kinds of inventory and priority ranking studies. And I hope that we can be useful in that capacity.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction there. What Dr. Holley is talking about is signaling. And I think, again, I only have what's in my ore body. And so I can't tell you which of those things is most important. That's almost a distinction that comes from either policy or it comes from the commercial sector. And so I need a signal from one of them to say, actually, this is the thing I need right now. And we want, in a perfect world, that policy would be, you know, very forward-looking and not reactionary. Because again, if you tell me you want something that's in my tailings, it's going to take me a while to get it out of there and design the flow sheet, as we said, right? And get it to a midstream processor who can refine it to what you need. And so none of this stuff is fast. And so we have to be looking ahead to the future and not just kind of constantly reacting if we're going to do this.
Bert, any closing thoughts on this or
Oh,
anything else we missed?
Yeah, the private sector needs the price of the material to be able to respond to it. And absent a fair and competitive market with a clear price now and into the future, I think, to Elizabeth's point, we need as many different parties at the table as possible, identifying national strategy and priority, and to help prime the pump of the mineral ecosystem we want to build.
Great. Well, I'm pretty pleased at how prescient it was for us to have the price webinar yesterday leading up to this conversation, because I am now understanding much greater how these issues are so complementary in terms of opportunity and challenge they present. So worth it for the end of year sprint and getting webinars out. I want to thank our panelists for joining us today. Dr. Holley for your presentation and your insights, and then Chairman Palmer for joining us virtually, hopping in virtually via video for a bit there at the hub. Thank you guys, and we'll happily follow up with any questions people have that we didn't get to. Have a great rest of your day.